Hey guys, Razzback 14, the Armory Guild, we're back. Well, we got to put this thing back together now. So we're going to take our time doing it and make sure I explain everything. So this may take at least 2 parts here to do this, and that's fine. It's not a problem. So we're going to start with the decocking lever bearing and the decocking lever hammer. Now the bearing itself, it has this lip around it, this flange around it. When it goes inside the barrel or inside the frame, it's milled out that it fits in there a certain way and kind of locks into position to keep it from turning. Also, when it's inside the frame, this lip right here of the decocking lever rests right here. So when it's together, it actually is doing this type of it fits together like this. So when you put this bearing in, you just work it in. I use my finger, and it pops right into the position that it's supposed to. And it'll just lock down. Just make sure that this little lip is sticking out of this hole here in the frame, and that's where the decocking lever this part of the decocking lever, this little lip here, will slide into it. Just drop the decocking lever right on, and then at this point, the spring itself, also on this bearing, I should have showed you this. Well, I can't really show you, I don't have the camera to, but right here on this part of the bearing, there's a little lip cut into it. And what that does is that holds this part of the spring. So when you put it in, and make sure that this point, this end of the spring is down, because this goes into this hole right here. When you drop this in, when you drop the spring in, it will hook onto that bearing. And at that time you can let go. It won't fall back through, because the spring itself will hold it. Now what I do is I take my flathead screwdriver and I grab hold of this hook on the spring itself, and I just pull it around until it hooks to this hole and drops it right in. Okay? And then you can test the decocking lever, and it'll spring right back. That's simple. It's not hard to do at all. The next part that we're going to put in is the hammer stop and the hammer stop spring. Now the hammer stop spring, as you look at it, is kind of shaped like a lazy 2. Alright, it has a long end and it has a short end. And when I say end, it's got a long flat straight end and a short straight end. Okay, the short straight end actually goes through the hammer stop itself and has a recessed place back here that it actually rests in. So when you drop this spring into it, you can turn it over, and this short part of the spring will rest inside this recess. Now I usually hold it with my thumb and just start guiding it into the frame. And it goes at kind of a down angle. Once you get it started, you can let go of it, because the spring will stay in. Then look through the hole in the frame and push the hammer stop in until the holes line up so that you can put the hammer stop pin in. And it should be just about flush on the back side, and that's about it. You take the hammer stop pin from either side, doesn't matter, it can go on either side first, push it through the frame, and take your mallet, again, preferably a hard plastic, some type of mylar, and just pound it in. And if you use a hard rubber mallet or a hard mylar, you can go ahead and pound it to the frame. And they should come out about even on either side. And if not, tap it again until it is. And it's even on either side. Good to go. Okay. Now, the next thing you're going to put in is the hammer itself. And remember, when I took it apart, right inside here, there's a pin that's fixed inside. The hammer is split. It's split all the way, well, on this end and all the way through. It's got a groove cut out. It's a solid piece of metal, probably some sort of steel or aluminum, but it's got a milled out place. This pin right here, the hammer stop spring has got to rest on top of it. So if you will, when you put it in, it'll rest on top. If it goes below it, it won't allow it to cock. And if you do cock it, you'll damage the spring and the hammer stop. So when you put the hammer in, you'll actually start it in, pull it to the cock position, and pull it up. Okay? Now, what I do is I take my ring finger on my right hand, or my left hand, put it through the frame, and line it up until I see the hammer, the hole in the hammer will line up with the hole in the frame for me to put the hammer pivot pin in. Okay, and again, you can slide this in from either side, doesn't matter, and it'll go through. At that point, you want to make sure that the hammer stop spring is on top of that pin, and if you pull it up and it feels resistance, you know you got it. Okay, simple enough. The next thing that we're going to put into it is we're going to start putting in sections. We're going to put in the Sear, the ejector, the safety lever, the Sear spring. Okay, and the best way to start doing that is if you take the Sear pivot pin, start it into the frame. Now, you're going to want to start this from the left side, okay, and you're going to find out why here in just a minute, because we're going to put this in steps. Once you get that started through, take the ejector itself. There's two holes, okay. This hole here will actually go on to the Sear spring pin, which we did not remove from the frame. I didn't see it necessary to remove that from the frame. That's a little difficult to get in and out. It is knurled, and it does not prevent you from taking the rest of the frame apart. So it's still in there. But this pin goes through this first hole in the ejector. So you put it in, and then slide it down, and the back part of the ejector, just kind of pivot it down. The back part of the ejector goes between the frame and the hammer itself. Okay? The next thing you want to put in is a safety lever, and it has a small lip here which comes through the frame here on this, and we got to start pull that spring out a little bit, pull that back out. Very, very loose at this point. And so you have to keep this pin on the outside of it. When you put the safety lever in, it will go in with the lip facing toward you, and the Sear pivot pin goes through this large hole. So just put it in and guide the Sear pivot spring or pivot pin through that hole. Okay. Once it starts through, you can release it. Okay. Now, the Sear itself, we're going to put it in kind of an angle. It's got to almost take this type of a movement to get it in. Okay. Once it's in, I hold it usually with my middle finger, and again, push the pivot pin through until it holds the Sear in place. You can kind of tilt the frame back just a little bit. That will help. And then once it starts, you're good to go. Alright, the next thing is the Sear spring itself. Again, just hold it. Doesn't matter which way it goes. It's identical. So you can do it any way you want. So start it and then push the pivot pin on through. Okay? And just work it until it goes on through. And there it is. Now the pivot pin is a little bit short, so it's going to recess back into the part of the frame where the rails are. Make sure it is recessed inside the rails on either side. Okay? Center it the best you can so it looks even on both sides. You're about to put it under pressure, so it's not going to move. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put the tension back on the Sear spring, and I do this with my thumb. I press down on it, and then I take the flathead screwdriver and push it up underneath this Sear spring pin. So push it down. And then push it over, and it goes underneath the pivot spring, or rather the spring pin. Then you can test it by decocking it and letting the hammer up. Okay, battery ran out again, guys, sorry. But as I was saying, you can test it to make sure that you have the Sear and the Sear spring in correctly. Go ahead and cock the hammer back, it should snap. or it should cock, you ought to hear it click. Push down on the decocking lever, and then push the hammer forward as you release the decocking lever, and it should come forward without, it shouldn't bind. Okay? So it should click, and then come forward. And you know you got it in there right. Okay? The next thing we're going to put in is the mainspring and the hammer strut, and the hammer strut, or the mainspring seat. Now, this hammer strut, when you get ready to put it in, it must, for lack of a better expression, be toward the back end of the frame. And here's what I mean by that. If you hook that pin that we were talking about inside the hammer to this part of the strut, it will stay cocked. It will never won't allow the hammer to come home. It must hook into this part, and the hammer must be in the up position, okay? Because if it's in the cock position, you'll never get it in there correctly. So when you put the strut in, this part of the frame right here, as you look at it, it's actually, the strut's actually going to come out right back here and come down at this angle, okay? So that's why I say the strut must be toward the back end of the frame. It's not hard to do, and it should slide directly up in. And then once you get it in that position, just hold it, and then you can put the mainspring seat on, and I just use my hand and push it up until it snaps in place. All right. Now, if you'll notice, the strut's toward the back. Okay. There's some space here, and it almost, if you hold it directly, it'll be straight down. Okay. The way to test it: cock the hammer, and then decock it. Cock the hammer, and then decock it. You know you have it correctly. And that's all there is to it. Very, very simple to put that part on. Okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put the trigger bar and the trigger bar spring on, and then we'll continue in the next part. Now, the trigger bar and the trigger bar spring are very simple to put on. Just take the trigger, and it goes through the pin here on this bar, and then just drop the trigger back down into the frame. And then the trigger bar comes back to this point. Now, once you get on it. Now, what you can do, once you get this lined up, you will actually put the, you'll put the trigger pivot pin in, which is right here. Now, the trigger pivot pin on one side has a slot for looks like a screwdriver, and then it has two cuts in the pin itself. They must be facing down. All right. Now, this slot here in the middle, we'll get to what that is here in just a moment. But when you put this pin in, make sure that the slots are facing down, and just work it, and actually line up the trigger, dumbass. Line up the holes first. You won't have no problem putting it in. Do not push it all the way through yet, because you've got one other part to go on, and that is the slide catch. And it just simply slides on, and then you can go ahead and push the pivot pin the rest of the way through. All right, because that holds the slide catch lock, or the slide catch release, and it holds the trigger assembly. Okay. Now, at this particular point, the trigger bar, if you see it, it has a hook right here that hooks on, or a little cutout part here, goes right around the trigger pivot pin. That needs to be right up next to it, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to put the trigger bar spring on. Just like we did before, it's going to be, when you grab hold of it, you got a piece of this end that faces down that's going to go into this hole. So you're going to let that go into the hole, pivot it, and turn it, and then this hook right here will hook onto this part of the trigger bar that's cut out to do it. Just take your finger, guide it on. That simple. It's done. And then at this point, make sure you don't pinch yourself, and test it by doing this. Do not let this thing slam. Do not do a full cycle with it in there first. Okay? Just like that will be more than enough. Okay? Now, we'll get back and continue this on the next video because I'm almost out of time, and we're going to pick this up at part 2.